Evening, everyone, and welcome. If this is your first time at a Somerville Museum event, we want to offer a special welcome. We're so happy you're here tonight. The Somerville Museum was founded in 1896 as the Somerville Historical Society, and the museum's building on Central Street was constructed in the 1920s. The mission of the museum is to be a mirror to the city, to reflect its past and its present. Tonight's panel is called Voices from Somerville's Italian Community. This is the 6th event in a Somerville Museum Zoom series called Voices from Somerville: Culture, Community, and History. It was made possible tonight by Mass Humanities, the Massachusetts Foundation for the Humanities, and we thank them for their support. Special thanks tonight to the museum's executive director, Evelyn Battinelli, for her help in making tonight's event possible. Thanks also to the Somerville Museum's assistant director, Allison Drasner. Allison is the best. Tonight, we will listen to a historian from Somerville discuss connections between Italian and U.S. history. We'll also hear from 4 people with connections to the city's Italian community as they talk about their work, families, and experiences in Somerville's neighborhoods. They are all Somerville High School graduates. Following the panelists, we will have time for a few questions. We are lucky to have history professor, legal scholar, and Somerville resident Daniel Breen from Brandeis University with us this evening. Dan is a wonderful teacher, and in fact, he was the winner of the university's 2017 Excellence in Teaching Award. He is a good friend to the Somerville Museum, and we're grateful. We are also lucky to have Michael Capuano here with us tonight, who is a former U.S. representative from 1999 to 2019, the mayor of Somerville from 1990 to 1998, and a Somerville alderman in the 1970s and 80s. His father was the first Italian American elected to the Somerville Board of Aldermen. We're also happy to have Bob DeGuardia with us this evening. Bob is a professional musician and an adjunct professor at Suffolk University. He generously recorded the music you heard as you were joining the Zoom, O Sole Mio, and we will hear another one of his recordings at the end of the event. Bob played music in Somerville's clubs and on the streets for Somerfest in the 1960s and 70s. Peter Galeno is a recipient of a Somerville Historic Preservation Award. He's also recipient of a Somerville Garden Award for continuing an Italian garden that was started by his father. His uncle was part of the local Cosmas and Damian Society, celebrating the patron saints of Gaeta, Italy. Finally, we are lucky to have Regina Pizzo with us this evening. Regina is Chairman Emeritus and Partner at Goodwin Procter LLP. She was the first woman to lead an AmLaw 100 firm in the United States and one of the youngest when appointed managing partner at age 42. Periodically, we will also hear from the museum's executive director, Evelyn Battinelli, whose parents immigrated to Somerville from Italy. Most of all, we want to thank all of you again for being here with us this evening on a rainy Thursday. We're really happy you're here. If you have any questions, just type them in the chat and we can hopefully get to some of them at the end of the evening. So let's start tonight with historian Dan Breen. Oh,
Thank
and
you very
also
much.
please, I'm sorry, stay muted on during the event. Thanks so much.
Okay, and I will start by sharing my screen. And if I could do that successfully, we'll get started with a very short presentation before we get to our panelists, who are the real stars of the evening. And I just wanted to say a few general words about the background of the Italian immigration to the United States. And I want to begin with this slide here. So here's a world map, of course. In the greener the country, the darker green the country, the more likely it was that you'd find Italian immigration to that country. And one thing you might be able to tell from this map is that there was an awful lot of Italian immigration to South America, not just North America. And in fact, if you were an Italian considering immigration from Italy in the middle of the 19th century, about the time of Italian unification in 1861, it's very likely that your preference would be to go to Brazil, Uruguay, or Argentina rather than the United States. And in fact, the fact is that in the world today, the country with the most residents with Italian ancestry outside Italy is not the United States, it's actually Brazil, a country in which 32 million people claim some Italian ancestry. So if you go to Brazil, for example, you can see the city of Nova Veneza in the southern part of Brazil. Here's the gate you'd go in to enter Nova Veneza. And because so many people from the Veneto went there in the 19th century, it won't surprise you to learn that if you go to the major public park in Nova Veneza in Brazil, you'll see gondolas, courtesy of the city of Venice, very valued gift to the people of southern Brazil. And not only did Brazil get an awful lot of immigrants from Italy, but also Argentina. And according to some statistics, nearly half of all residents of Argentina today have some Italian ancestry. And among the famous Argentine Italians who made their contributions to Argentina in the world is this man here. That's Quirino Cristiani, whose parents left Lombardy when he was 4 years old in the middle of the 19th century. And at the age of 21, he became the man who gave us the very first animated film called Il Apostol in the very early 20th century. So all told, nearly 30 million people left Italy between 1850 and 1960, with the high point of that immigration occurring in the year 1913, when 900,000 people left Italy. But it was only in 1890 or so that the United States became the primary destination for people who wanted to leave Italy. And by then, 1890, most of the immigration was coming from southern Italy and Sicily, and it is not hard to see why. Rural poverty in those areas by the mid to late 19th century was distressingly common. And there are several reasons for that, several reasons why this kind of poverty existed, leaving you perhaps to consider emigrating to another part of the world, maybe the United States. First, one big phenomenon here was after unification in 1861, the new government in Rome embarked upon all manner of construction projects, infrastructure projects, all to the greater glory of the new kingdom of Italy. But if they're going to build a lot of new infrastructure like bridges and roads, and if they're going to encourage railroads, that meant higher taxes. So if you were living in rural areas, close to the margins anyway, those higher taxes were not going to be good for you. And of course, people in southern Italy tended to live in rural areas, especially in the 19th century. And second, in addition to that, even as your taxes were going up, by the late 19th century, the price of anything you had to sell, if you were a farmer, depending upon the market for whatever you were growing, was going to be drastically diminished. And the reason for that is the effect of trade, especially from North America. So how could you compete as a rural farmer in Italy with massive ton after ton after ton of grain shipped in over the steamships and the railroads, especially from the United States and Canada? And I'll give you a startling statistic. In 1870, the United States, all told to the rest of the world, was only exporting 50 million bushels of grain a year. But 10 years later, 1880, we exported 175 million bushels of grain, dumping all that grain on international markets. And of course, that depressed the price. Not too good for you if you had to make a living selling food in Western Europe, particularly impoverished central and southern Italy. Third, as if that wasn't bad enough, and I think it probably was, if you lived in southern Italy, especially, anything you bought in the stores, any manufactured item that you couldn't avoid going somewhere else to buy, was probably going to be more expensive for you because the new Kingdom of Italy, especially by the 1880s, had a high protective tariff on any industrial imports coming in from the rest of the world to Italy because they wanted to protect their own growing industries. And that was good if you were a factory worker or especially a factory owner in Turin or Genoa or especially Milan. That was fine for you because that kept out a lot of foreign competition. But it wasn't very good for you if you were living on the land because everything now that had to be manufactured by somebody else was probably going to be more expensive for you because of that. And finally, in addition to all that, this was happening at just the same time that population was going up in central and southern Italy, especially on the land. And that meant that land holdings progressively over time were subdivided and subdivided and subdivided as families had to leave land to their growing families. This member here, this son here, this son here. And that meant that if they were going to raise their own families, of course, on smaller and smaller parcels of land, it was much harder to make a go of it by the end of the 19th century, even than it was at the middle of the 19th century. And that was a phenomenon that rural Italians in the late 19th century very much had in common with the Irish in the early to mid 19th century, and also a reason to emigrate. And finally, as if all that wasn't enough, the fact was that the brand new Kingdom of Italy, to show how modern it was, began to end the practice of permitting the existence of communal land, communal pasture land, communal woodlots, where people in villages for centuries have been able to go to pasture any livestock they might have free of charge. It was communal land, and also to gather wood if they wanted to in communal woodlots. That was all put under private ownership more and more in the 19th century, which meant you had to pay for the privilege, and that was going to make it even harder for you. So as your economic life became ever more precarious, especially in central and southern Italy, there were two things you might be able to do to continue to survive. And one thing that you had to do was depend upon your family, depend upon your immediate and your extended family, if you were going to have any chance at all, because the government didn't care much about you, but your family always did. And the second thing you might do is send young men in the family overseas to earn money and send some of that money back if possible. And in fact, 80% of the Italians who emigrated in the 1880s and 1890s were young men sent by their families to earn money somewhere else, increasingly in the United States. And for many years, especially beginning in the 1880s, at least half of all Italian immigrants and over 60% of Southern Italians would leave Italy, go to the United States or a country like Brazil or Argentina with no intention of staying there. They'd go usually in the spring on a steamship out of Naples, probably, and they'd work in the construction trades usually for the spring and the summer and into the fall. And whenever they could, they would send money back in the form of remittances. Here's an example of young men who have gone to the United States to work, in this case, in the coal mines, sending what money back they could, with the intention all the time being to return to Italy, usually in October or November, once the weather turned much colder. And they would often do this more than once. Some young men would go 8 or 9 times, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, earning money in the warmer months and spending often the cooler months back in Italy. They were called birds of passage. And this phenomenon of return immigration constantly from the United States back to Italy was something they did not have in common with the Irish. Only about 6% of the Irish, once they were in the United States, went back to Ireland. Among Italians, it was more like 50%, and maybe a little bit more than that, depending upon what region they were from. And they usually didn't have a hard time getting a job, because if you were an Italian immigrant hoping to find work in the United States, there was usually a padrone who would help you, that is a labor broker. And some of these labor brokers were not overly scrupulous. They might set you up with a job maybe somewhere in the Lower East Side or in the construction trade in a place like Pittsburgh or Boston or Cincinnati. And they would say, why don't I keep some of your earnings for you just for a while? I'll act like your bank and we'll send some of it back home. And maybe now and then they would charge so much in fees that there wouldn't be much left over to send home. But other padrones were perfectly honest and in fact caring people. And here's the most famous one. That's Luigi Fugazi of Greenwich Village, very well known and respected among the Italian community, who really took seriously the idea of a padrone acting in the public good for the benefit of immigrants and especially their families back home. And so the remittances would go back home, and little by little, conditions began to improve in southern Italy, especially by the early 20th century, but not so much that it made a big difference in emigration. There continued to be reasons to go. And one of the big reasons happened at 5:20 in the morning, 5:20 a.m. on December 28th, 1908, when the worst earthquake to this day in European history hit the city of Messina in Sicily, a horrible disaster in which that city, Messina, lost over half of its population, probably in a matter of minutes. The hurricane struck, the earthquake struck when most people were still asleep, and Messina had more people than usual that day because so many people had come to Messina to see a special production of Aida, and they had spent the night, and for too many of them, they would never see another night again. Messina became known as the city of the dead because there are so many corpses trapped in the ruins, and it would take so long finally to dig them out and see to a decent burial. Over 100,000 people died in Sicily and southern Italy, and there was a 40-foot tsunami that basically inundated the city of Reggio Calabria on the other side of the strait, killing almost every doctor and nurse in the city. This was a catastrophe. And after this, the government of Italy, after 1908, especially encouraged people to immigrate. I would like to say, though, at this point, that the Italian government very often encouraged immigration from Italy. They saw it as a net gain for them because the more Italians went to the United States, for example, especially to work, the more remittances would be sent home to their families back in Italy. And the more that was true, the more those dollars might be spent by Italian families who may now have a little bit of extra income to buy Italian bonds, in effect lending money to the Italian government with that money. They could not just pay their debts, but they could buy Italian government bonds, which the Italian government liked very much. And in addition to that, people in the United States from Italy had an appetite for Italian goods. So Italy could export items to a growing Italian-American consumer market. The government seemed to win, at least in its opinion, in every way you can think of by immigration. And so it continued to encourage immigration right through World War I. 1913, as I said, was the height of Italian immigration. And by 1913, the city of Naples was the scene of so much immigration to the New World especially, that the leading business in Naples was actually catering to immigrants who were waiting there to catch a steamship, one of the 7 steamship companies that would operate out of Naples and go to the New World. Well, once somebody made the decision to stay in America permanently, as they increasingly came to do over the years, and the bird of passage phenomenon became less common and more people decided to stay, what would happen ultimately was that people already in Italy would send letters back home and encourage family members to come join them in the United States. And often, if they could, they would send these prepaid tickets in the mail back to family members in Italy so that somebody could join them from wherever they were. And actually, by 1910, half of all Italian immigrants coming to the United States were using these prepaid tickets sent to them from people already in the United States. And these increasing family concentrations from different regions of Italy in various distinct places of the United States meant that often Italian neighborhoods had a distinct regional Italian flair. Chicago, for example, had one Italian neighborhood, mostly from people from Salerno. Another neighborhood close by the Cyrus McCormick Reaper factory mostly had people from southern Tuscany. Little Italies began to proliferate across the United States, especially by the early 20th century. This is the famous West End of Boston. We might mention this a little bit later. That was very much a mixed neighborhood, but over 40% of the West End at its height was Italian. This is a family gathering in Portland. Portland, Maine had a Little Italy for a while. And most people in Portland's Little Italy actually came from the Abruzzo, from Abruzzo. And they came from the area around a little place called Letto Montopolo in Abruzzo. And this is also a well-known Little Italy. This happens to be in Youngstown, Ohio. That's Briar Hill, an Italian community. Different Little Italies could be multiplied. There are so many of them. Not many now. Among other things, many of them, like the West End, were victims of urban renewal, especially in the mid to late 20th century. But before I turn it over to the panelists, as I draw it to a close, I would just like to mention this man. This, of course, is the Bishop of Piacenza. That's Father Giovanni Battista Scalabrini. And he founded what became the Missionaries of St. Charles Borromeo, usually known as the Scalabrinians, partly as a charitable aid society for immigrants leaving Italy, usually for the New World, and also to encourage them once they were here to continue their allegiance to the Catholic Church. He had been led to establish this order, this charitable order, by the sight of dreadfully poor, bedraggled would-be immigrants waiting to catch a train from Milan to Genoa. And it was in 1915 that one of the Scalabrinians, one of his order, Father Nazareno Perpizzi, he was the one who established the parish of St. Anthony of Padua, which is still, of course, a vibrant part of the life of Somerville. And he would stay, Father Perpizzi, from 1915, I think when he was about 24, all the way till his death in 1960. And 1960 is a good landmark of a year, not just for that reason, but also because that marks the end that historians usually give to the great period of Italian immigration. By that time, the Italian economic miracle had taken hold. Times were much better in Italy. And so a century, little over a century of immigration really began to wind down. But I would like to point out in closing that St. Anthony's of Padua, which began largely as a church for Italian immigrants, is now host to a lot of different people from around the world, including people from Brazil. And it's nice to contemplate the fact that many of those Brazilian Americans have Italian ancestry in their background, as I began the presentation by pointing out. And so the story goes on. And now, as I stop my screen share, it's time to hear from other stories from residents of Somerville.
Dan, thank you so much. That was wonderful. And we are going to start the panel with Mike Capuano.
Thanks, Dan. I don't even know exactly what to say. We had a brief discussion the other day about all this. The truth is, I never really thought of myself in an ethnic terms. I know my heritage very well. I grew up right next door to my grandfather. But we thought of ourselves as Americans who happen to have an Italian heritage. My grandfather, not unusual. Everything Dan just said is all great in the macro sense, but in the individual sense, everybody I know that came here, all of the generation, well, 2 generations before me, but my grandfather's generation, for the most part, they came in for economic opportunity. They were pretty much all poor people. I mean, there were some who weren't, but almost all poor people, and they saw better opportunities here. In my family's case, my grandfather was an illegitimate child who grew up in an orphanage with no family, and illegitimate children in those days, and pretty much anywhere in the world, but certainly in Italy, they had no future. No one would talk to them. No one would give them a break. So he came to America. He got here in 1903 and landed in Somerville in 1908 after he got married and was able to buy a house. He was, as far as I'm concerned, the American miracle. Not because he made a lot of money, he never did, but he was able to put a life together with virtually no family and raise several children and own a 2-family house that to this day, I still have my cousin still lives there. And to this day, it pretty much violates every regulation there is because those houses were put together. They might have been built by professionals, but everything else in them was put together by friends and family members. Hey, I know a guy who's a plumber, and I know a guy who's an electrician, and nothing met code. That's not unusual. I don't see the story as very unusual. What I do remember is that again, I'm speaking as a 2nd generation Italian. My grandfather would not teach any of us Italian, which I to this day regret. But his argument was very simple. He said, "Look, you're an American. You speak American." He didn't say speak English. He said speak American. And don't get me wrong, I know a fair number of Italian words that my grandmother would used to yell at me and basically shut up and hurry up, let's get going. And I know a fair amount of Italian swear words that I heard later on in my life. But that's about it. I say this only to let you know there is a difference. Though we were very proud of our heritage, it was all about being American. At least that's what I saw. As far as growing up, I was aware of prejudices, but the truth is I didn't witness them on a firsthand basis very often. I will tell you, as you heard earlier, my father was the first Italian American to get elected. And yeah, there was a big fight, like there always is, amongst relatively poor people. Somerville in those days was relatively poor. And the Irish had come here early and been established. And by the way, my mother was Irish and very proud of her heritage, as I am as well. But in those days, when he ran for mayor in 1953 and 1955 against a man who actually later became a pretty good friend, Bill Donovan, who won. And the whole tenor of the campaign was Gaelic or Gaelic. So I mean, people don't understand that today. They think, well, you're all the same, and we are. But oftentimes, people who have similar situations or similar backgrounds, oftentimes they fight because they find different reasons to separate themselves. On the other hand, and most of us, at least in my generation, we're just the opposite. Honestly, I came to realize later on all the differences as you grow up. But that's not the way we were bred. Honestly, it was just the opposite. It was, let's bring everybody in. Let's feed everybody. Let's have a party. Let's have a glass of wine with everybody in the neighborhood. Let's share our garden. And I don't think that's unusual. I actually think it's a very common situation. And to be honest, when I became mayor, one of the first things I wanted to do was to get the garden awards going, which the Somerville Museum was very helpful on. And that was all about trying to show everybody likes gardens. It doesn't matter your nationality or your ethnicity. It's a beautiful thing to share. Some people grow flowers, other people grow tomatoes, other people grow other things, but everybody likes a nice garden, and everybody who has a garden wants to share it with as many people as they can. I guess I'm going to kind of cut it short to a certain extent. I do want to say that I'm very proud of the fact that my grandfather was one of the people that laid the cornerstone to St. Anthony's. He started going to St. Anthony's before there was a church. It was actually a little corner store at the bottom of Porter Street. That was the original St. Anthony's. And they did it because there were a lot of Italian-speaking people, especially the women who went to church. Most Italian men pretend they go to church, but they didn't. It was mostly Italian women. And most of them, because they were women, a lot of them were either at home or in very low-paying factory jobs with other Italian women. Had a harder time learning the language. And so therefore, when they want to go to church, they needed to be have sermons in Italian. St. Anthony's now, I think, is a proud church that mostly serves, I think today, it's mostly Brazilians who are going through the exact same type of situation. So anyway, for me, though I'm very proud of my heritage, my family has a very, very long tail and deep roots in this community. Truth is, I look at Italian heritage more as a reason that I grew up liking people and wanting to embrace more people than push away. So for me, that's kind of what it is. And I see there's a lot of people on this Zoom call that are actually have just as much to say about anything growing up Italian as I do. And I actually I'm hoping that some of them have some comments later on, and I'm looking forward to hearing. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And next we're going to hear from Bob DeGuardia.
Hi, everybody. My name is Bob DeGuardia. I am Italian, and I grew up in Somerville and graduated from Somerville High. Thereby, I qualify, I guess, to speak. I want to echo what Mike said. I never really thought of myself as Italian. I thought of that was my heritage, and that was what I ate, and some of the music that I listened to when my mother would play music. But I was definitely an American kid. I retired from a position of being director of ERP systems at Suffolk University back in 2019. I'm still in the faculty teaching information systems. I married a wonderful Irish girl named Mary Mahoney back in the early days, and we have 2 adult sons and 5 grandchildren. I am 100% Italian, and I am a professional musician, which means I get paid, not a lot. As a matter of fact, I don't play for the money. I play because I have to. My first time I was paid as a musician was when I was 13, and we were being paid to stop playing because I guess we were really pretty bad. And some guy said, "I'll give you all $5 a piece if you stop," and we did. And I figured, okay, this is good. I'm making money. I'm second generation. My parents immigrated from Italy to the United States I believe in the 20s. My maternal grandfather came to the United States when he was 15 years old, and he started a family and ended up with 9 children on my mother's side. And they lived in the West End, as we heard earlier, until it went away. I was born in Somerville on Hamlet Street. I was born at home because my mother didn't make it to the hospital. And like most Italian families, we love to eat. Every time there was a holiday, my aunts and uncles would gather at my mother's house to eat, and eating would start at about 10 o'clock in the morning and would keep going till about 11 at night. I want to, again, attempt to share my screen with you to talk about, let's see, here it is. Yeah, this is gonna work. Okay, bear with me as I press buttons here and try to make the, okay, stay there. And review, no, I don't want to review, I want to view. Don't you like it when people talk to themselves? Yeah. Like I'm doing now because I'm plugging things up. All right, I'm gonna go scan through these without starting it out to keep things from being compromised. So this is me in my element. This is my uncle's restaurant that was in Porter Square called the Newtown Grill. My Uncle Ben was the chef there, And every one of member of my family, including myself, worked at that restaurant. I was washing dishes there when I was 12 years old. My mother was a waitress. Two of my aunts ran the sub shop, and my other uncles would come in to help out with cooking. So that, again, the food aspect of it. Another one of my uncles, my Uncle Dave, he didn't own PA's club, but he did have a construction company back in the 60s and 70s called Advanced Construction. And he was the only distributor of this thing called Colorado Stone. And when you walk around Somerville, you can still see some of these buildings that have this stone on it. And it's probably close to 60 years old. So people who bought it and put it on their dwellings certainly got their money's worth. Let's see. He actually was featured in the Boston Phoenix once as a celebrity chef before we had celebrity chefs. And I know a lot of people who like the food there, including myself. My earliest memories of remembering anything or knowing anything, I lived in Cambridge, right near the Somerville line. And we were really afraid of those Somerville kids because we thought that they were, going to steal our bicycles or our lunch money. And to my horror, my mother told me at 9 years old that we were moving to Somerville. We went from this quiet, calm neighborhood near Harvard to East Somerville on Pearl Street between Walnut and McGrath Highway. Quite a culture shock. We lived on the second floor of a two-family house. And the first day there, I was out on the porch looking down, and I saw this kid about my age in a flatbed truck glaring at me, like, how dare you come into my neighborhood? And eventually he became my best friend. His name was Rocco. His parents were from Italy. And so I had the advantage of getting the food and all the other culture from being sort of an adopted parts of his family, including being chased by his grandmother with the broom when he said something inappropriate to her. He would chase him around the house literally with the broom. One day, Rock came down with a quart of homemade wine. They made wine in the cellar of the house. Now, Rocco had been drinking it since he was a little baby. I had never had wine before. I was 15 years old. And we drank that whole bottle of wine. And then he got more and we drank more of that. Well, I can only tell you that it ended in a disaster, and it kept me away from red wine until I was in my mid-20s. At one point at the night, I thought it would be a good idea to go call out to a girl in her house because I liked her and I was too shy, but luckily she didn't come out. When I moved to Somerville, I was already playing the cornet. I lived in Cambridge and they gave us cornets, and that's what this is here. I wanted to play the saxophone because I'd had a lot of buttons on it and it intrigued me. But the salesman convinced my mother that I had an overbite and that playing the saxophone would make it worse and I'd have terrible buck teeth. I needed an instrument that would push in a mouthpiece so that it would be like wearing braces. So my mother bought a cornet, not even a trumpet, but a cornet, which is this thing right here. And anyway, I started playing the St. Benedict's Band marching band with Mr. Bizier. And at one point, he grafted us to, when we were in the 7th grade, to play in the high school band for football games and parades. I was terrible, but there was this one guy who was the most incredible trumpet player I had ever heard in my young life. He played an entire parade without music. He memorized everything, never made a bad note, was lead trumpet, led the band. His name was Freddie DiLorenzo. And he was a lot older than, well, not a lot older, but somewhat older than me. We weren't in the same circle, but I really admired him. When he graduated from high school, he enlisted in the Marines. And sadly, he was killed in action in Vietnam on August 12th, 1969. At 19 years old. And it really hit me that, this guy would never play again. And it really, it it was like a thunderbolt when I heard that. Anyway, like many musicians, my life changed in uh, February of 1964 when the Beatles hit the Ed Sullivan Show. And my sister was older than I, and she wanted to watch it. And I watched it with her, and I watched the reaction that these guys were getting from all these girls. And I was 11, and I was beginning to get interested in girls. And I said, I always had a very logical thought process, and I thought, I'm not going to get any girls with a cornet, so I need to become a rock and roll star. So I joined a band as a singer. That's the band there that you see. I didn't know how to play the guitar yet. And the guy sitting on his amp was my brother. He was Italian. The guy playing the drums was Portuguese. The first guitar player actually came from Cuba. And then the next one came from Walnut Street, and he was also Italian. We called ourselves the younger generation. And we played at CYO dances and other things. And we played this thing once down at the Mystic Ave Projects at a teen club. And we just got discovered by this guy who was an MIT student who liked the band, and he started booking us into frat parties on college campuses. And none of us were old enough to drive, so we had to hire somebody's uncle to be our manager. And it was amazing. I mean, we were making money, and I was singing. And the only reason I was a singer was that I knew words. Nobody else could memorize lyrics, so it worked out well for me. We hit all the CYO dances and the high school dances and stuff like that. We eventually, morphed into different bands, but that was a lot of fun, and I knew that I was going to become a musician. We would practice. Somerville never lacked for musical talent. There were bands on every block rehearsing. We would rehearse in my basement, and sometimes the police would come and tell us that we were too loud, and we would, turn down. But about 15 minutes later, we would start up again. I quit school when I was a junior because I was being rebellious and stupid. And luckily, my long-term strategy of meeting girls in a band finally worked out in that one of the guys in my band said, "Hey, my sister likes you." And that was 47 years ago. And we're still married. So that strategy of, finding girls as a musician worked out. There are lots of talented guys at high school. I'm trying to do three things at once here, and I'm not doing any of them well. Well, let me just
Bob, I hate to interrupt, Bob. We're running a little short on time, so
all right.
I give you the heads up.
Thank you so much. I always talk more than I think I do. So I'm going to try this. I'm going to go work without a net here and see if I can play this song for you without disturbing me or you. Thank you all for listening to me. And one last slide. I have to show you this. Somerville leads the way, always has and always will. Thank you.
Bob, thank you so much. And next we're going to hear from Peter Galeno.
Hello, you can hear me, right? Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. I am going to talk about my family, Gaeta, my family's hometown, and of course, food and cooking, since any discussion about Italians without a discussion about food would really be lacking. I'm going to start with my family because I think it's sort of emblematic of the immigrant experience, and particularly the Italian immigrant experience, as Dan Breen outlined it. My family's life in America begins in 1912, and as Dan suggested, that was one of the peaks of immigration for Italians to come to America. In 1912, my grandparents came to Somerville, Cambridge. They lived over on Warren Street and Medford Street in Miller's River. My father was born in 1911, so he actually spent the first year of his life in Somerville. My Uncle Joe was born in 1912, so he was born in Somerville and was technically an American citizen. Well, not technically, in reality, an American citizen. My grandparents moved back to Italy because, guess what? My grandmother didn't like the weather in Boston, and who can blame her for that? And as Dan suggested, I was actually kind of surprised to find this out. My grandfather came back to the Boston area a couple of times up until I think the 1920s, the middle of the 1920s, worked for a year and then went back to Italy. I was surprised that people could do that so freely at the time. Our family life in the States really begins probably in 1930 when my Uncle Joe emigrated from Gaeta to America. He came in through New York into Ellis Island. And even though he was an American citizen, he was held in detention for almost a month until somebody would come and claim him, basically to sponsor him. Finally, somebody came down from Medford, he was sponsored, and he moved back up to this area and settled over in East Cambridge on that Warren Street, Medford Street area. He got a job working at the Roma Bakery. I'm sure some of you remember the Roma Bakery. It was on Somerville Ave across from where the Target is today. He became known as Joe the Baker. He made $2 a week, kind of remarkable. He was able to save enough money, go back to Italy at some point in the mid-30s, I'm guessing, pay off his debt because he had borrowed money to come to America, got married, probably with an arranged marriage, and then came back to the States. Joe begins kind of the chain of emigration for my family. My uncle Cosmo and his family moved from Gaeta in the early 1950s. My family moved here from Dublin, Ireland, which I'll explain a little later on, in the early 1960s. My aunt and her 3 sons came in the early 1970s, and my grandmother came back with them. I don't know how she felt about that, but she may have not had very much choice. And my uncle Guido came with his family in the mid-1970s. At that point, most of my father's family was in the States. He had a brother still in Gaeta, and as Dan also brought up, he had a sister that moved to Argentina. So there was a family also in Argentina. When Joe was here in the 1930s, he became friendly with a family, Gaetana Amendola and his family. They were very much involved with the feast of Cosmas and Damian. Cosmas and Damian are the patron saints of Gaeta. They were twin physicians who were martyred during the Roman Empire. They are attributed to have several miraculous cures. And supposedly they saved Gaeta from the plague in the 18th century. So that's the primary reason that they are the patron saints of Gaeta. In 1948, Cosmas and Damian bought an abandoned house on Porter Street, and my uncle Joe and his friend Gaetano demolished the house that was on the site, and they helped to build a shrine that's still on that site, a shrine or a chapel. In the 1970s, the shrine was restored by a mason who was seriously ill, but he prayed to Cosmas and Damian and promised that he would fix the shrine if he were cured. He was cured, and the shrine is in pretty good shape today. You know, if you want to go by, you can see it. And during the Feast of Cosmas and Damian, it's open to the public. Let's see. Some of my cousins are still involved with the Cosmas and Damian Society and organizing it. They haven't had a feast for 2 years because of COVID, but I understand that there's a plan to go full steam ahead this September. So hopefully that will happen. I should also mention that there was another social club over in Somerville near where the Roma Bakery was, called the Progresso Club. It was I guess a quasi-political men's club, a social club that would have monthly events, dinner dances. The men would get together there, play poker and an Italian card game called Scopa. My family story is a little bit different. My father was in the Merchant Marines, and in 1944, he ended up in Dublin, Ireland. He met my mother, got married, and abandoned his fiancée back in Gaeta. I don't know how she felt about that, but probably she was not very happy. He opened a fish and chip shop. The Italians in Dublin at the time were a very close-knit community. Ireland was pretty restricted in terms of immigration, and there was a good deal of poverty in Ireland at the time. So my father opened up a fish and chip shop, and then in 1963, he decided to emigrate to America. So my family came to America. We settled in Somerville. I went to Somerville High. My younger sisters went to St. Anthony's down the street from where we live now on Green Street. My father was, very much an innovative and creative guy. He taught himself how to play the mandolin, and of course we would have sing-songs in the Irish and Italian tradition, a little bit of both, I must say. My father was also a very good cook. He learned a lot of tricks of the trade of cooking from his friends in the restaurant business in Italy. He made very, the typical traditional Italian stuff, homemade pasta, lasagna, cannelloni with an aurora sauce, steak alla pizzaiolo were some of his specialties. I got to say that if you haven't had lasagna made with fresh noodles, you really haven't had lasagna. Gaeta is a seaport, and it's famous for a lot of seafood dishes. There's one in particular called parnocchia, which I've never seen anywhere else. It's a kind of shellfish, sort of a cross between, I guess, in taste, between a lobster and a shrimp. It's quite a delicacy and is pretty seasonal. One time, my grandmother, when she went to Gaeta, brought 2 kilos of live parnocchia at the bottom of her suitcase through customs at Logan Airport. Who would suspect a kindly old woman to be carrying contraband? However, probably the most important dish from Gaeta, the local dish, every town in Italy has a local dish. The local dish in Gaeta is called la tiella. La tiella is kind of a cross between pizza and calzone. It's a pie that's filled with things like squid, bacala, escargot, spinach. My favorite is squid. When I invite people over for dinner and tell them that we're having squid pie, they're usually a bit squeamish until they taste it, and then they become converts. And
I hate to interrupt you. We are at time, but I was hoping you could spend just a quick minute talking about the garden.
Okay. One of the things my father did was to build a terraced Italian garden in the back. It has all of the typical things that you would find in an Italian garden: a peach tree, a plum tree. I planted fig trees, tomatoes, eggplant, peppers, all of those typical things. As Mike Capuano talked about the garden awards, won an Italian Garden Award back when the awards were given in the early 90s. And like most people in Somerville, I'm a little bit of a mixed bag. So I'll end by saying slanta and buon appetito to everybody. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter. And our last panelist tonight is Regina Pisa.
Thanks, Sharon. So you're going to hear threads of what other people have spoken to in some of my comments, because our experiences were all very similar, I think. I was born in Somerville, grew up in Somerville, went through Somerville public schools, lived 45 years of my life in Somerville before I moved to my current home. I'm a first generation Italian American. My father, Anthony, immigrated to the U.S. from Gaeta, from Italy, after World War II. He had spent 17 years in the Italian Navy, as did his father and his brothers, had gone through all of the wars. And when he went back home after 17 years fighting various wars for Italy, there was not much left. And so he and a friend boarded a merchant ship and were dropped off in Mobile, Alabama. They made their way up north where my father had an uncle, and eventually showed up at my grandmother's, what then became my grandmother's house in Somerville, in Hall Street in Somerville. And he had a little piece of paper which his mother had written my grandmother's name and her address in Somerville and said, "Go find her. She'll welcome you to the States." And so he showed up one day at my grandmother's house in Hall Street. My grandmother had come to the States at the turn of the century in the 1900s, and she had married and bought this house in Hall Street in 1926, right before the Depression. And it was a duplex house. It was two-family houses put together. And this house is more than a house. It became the embodiment of our family, this house. And I'll talk a little bit about it. But later, as you can tell, my father eventually married my mother, who was my grandmother's daughter, and moved into this house. And this house was, it's almost like, when I think of it, it's almost mythical, frankly, when I talk about the house in Hall Street. It was a duplex house, 4 families. My grandmother and grandfather lived in one apartment above us. I and my parents lived in another apartment. My Uncle Tom and his wife and 2 sons lived in the 3rd apartment, and my Aunt Anne, my mother's sister, her husband, my Uncle Joe, and their 5 daughters lived in the other apartment. So we had 8 children in this house of about the same age who all played in this backyard together. In fact, the house had a huge backyard and became very much the focal point of our street. We lived on Hall Street. It was a teeny little street. It's 15 houses that at the time I was growing up had around my age 60 children on this little street of 15 houses who would all show up in the street at any time of the day. You didn't need a playground. You just needed to go out to the street at any time during the day and you would find people to play with. our house, because it had a big ground and because a big backyard and because there were 8 of us, was the focal point of a lot of activity on the street. We used to have an annual carnival. I remember Boomtown. We had an annual Boomtown carnival at our street, and the entire street would participate in this from our backyard. And I won't, for another day, those stories, but my cousin Linda told more kids they were going to get more things that lots of parents were upset with us. Anyway, it was a great house to grow up in. My grandfather had a huge garden of vegetables that he essentially fed the entire street in the summer with. He and I had a feud between flowers and vegetables. Every time I wanted to plant some flowers, he would insist that it was an ounce of dirt that he couldn't plant vegetables on. And this feud went on my entire life. And it was a good-natured feud, but it was a feud. And eventually detente was struck when he put a fence around his garden, and I was allowed to plant flowers on the outside of the garden around the fence. Years later, when I went off to the UK to school, and I called home the first time, my mother said, "You're not going to believe it, but Grandpa's out there taking care of your flowers and planting more when you come home." I mean, then I knew that we had reached an ultimate detente over the flowers. We had a wine cellar every year that make wine in our cellar. We lived on the first floor, so when I was lying in bed at night and it was winemaking season, I could smell the fermentation of the wine in my bedroom. That's how close it was. But that was part of life. They made wine. My grandmother was the person who everybody went to when they wanted to come to America. My father wasn't alone, as everybody seemed to be given a piece of paper with my grandmother's name and address, and all sorts of people showed up at her door wanting to be welcomed in America and to be given their start. And she welcomed that. She left behind 10 siblings. Almost all of their children immigrated to the States, and she became their sort of old-fashioned welcome wagon, as you were, as they came to the States and as well as children of friends of hers who grew up in Gaeta would find their way to this house on Hall Street. You never knew who was going to walk up the backyard looking for my grandmother, because she was going to give them their start. She also was the person, she had this uncanny, people thought she had healing powers. So whenever anyone had a sick child, they would come to her house with the baby, anyone on the street or any relative, swaddled in a blanket with a fever, asking her to help them. She had no medical degree, she had no medical science, but she was viewed as the person who could heal all things. And she was that type of person. My grandfather, her husband, Pasquale, she was Gelsomina, he was Pasquale, was the foreman in the meatpacking plant down in Brick Bottom. He was the foreman at the J.P. Squires meatpacking plant in Brick Bottom. And that was important. I said the word foreman twice because that was important, because he could get people jobs. And so when people weren't coming up the side yard to get shelter, they were coming up looking for a job. And he would find jobs for anybody who was new to the States, who was earnest and wanted to make a decent living, was hardworking. He would get them a job either in the meatpacking plant, or their daughters or cousins would get jobs in the office. But he would find jobs for anybody who wanted a job at J.P. Squires. So there was always a steady stream of people coming in our yard. We had a grapevine in our yard, and my grandfather grew grapes. My grandmother made Concord grape jam with it. It wasn't good for wine. And every spring, summer, and fall, all the families in this house would meet in the backyard under the grapevine. My grandmother would have a pot of coffee going. And probably 2 or 3 nights a week, you'd hear those footsteps up the side yard, and there'd be somebody visiting with homemade cakes or cookies, paying respects to my grandmother and grandfather, because there was this generational gratitude to them for all of the things that they had done to get immigrant families started in the States. When my grandmother died, she was well into her 90s, there was a huge line at the funeral parlor. I remember I was so surprised because most of her friends were dead. So who were these people who were showing up at her funeral? And I remember asking one of my family members, and they said, they're all the children and grandchildren of all those people that she welcomed to the States when they were new immigrants to the States who've come to pay this ran deep. The gratitude ran deep in terms of thanking her for what she did for them, what my grandfather did for them in terms of getting them all jobs. So there were many life lessons we learned at Hall Street. My grandmother would tell us as girls, girls, when you're looking for a husband, keep both eyes open. And after you've found him, close one. And that lesson has served me well in many things in my life. As I chaired my own law firm, I would think of those words a lot. Or chaired a law firm, not my law firm. She would also say to any young boys who dared to show up on our porch to take any of us out, she'd sit on the front porch and she would meet them at the front door. And she would say, remember, boys, take her home the way you found her. And there was no question in any of our minds what she was talking about. I'm going to tell one more story about Hall Street before I just wrap up with a few themes. My grandmother bought this house in 1926, and shortly thereafter, she lost her husband to throat cancer and her daughter to Spanish flu. And she was a young mother of four children, one of whom had died, a husband who had died, spoke very little English. Her tenants, when the Depression hit, her tenants were unemployed and they couldn't pay the rent in that 4-family house. And so there was a family doctor who was visiting the house, and he read the letter on the kitchen table that the National Bank, Evelyn, you know the name of this bank. Anyway, that the
Highland Trust
was going to foreclose on the house. And it turned out that this Dr. Boyle was a director of the Highland Trust. And so he wrote a letter to the bank that basically said, Mrs. Talmo has had hard times. She's lost her husband. She's lost a child. Her tenants can't pay the rent because of the depression. They're unemployed, but she's a woman of good character. And I know that she'll stand behind this mortgage. And so on the basis of that letter, the bank essentially forbeared on the mortgage, didn't foreclose on the house, but said that you have to deliver 10 cents a week on this mortgage. So we know she was going to bring in wash to earn some money. So we know that you're earnest about paying this mortgage. And my Uncle Tom was sent to the bank every Friday with 10 cents to pay down the mortgage. And eventually her tenants began paying and she began paying her mortgage again. I think of that story a lot. I don't know that it could happen today. Mike, you were the chairman of the banking committee, or you were on the banking committee. It couldn't happen today, Mike. But it's a great story to think about how other people reached out to young immigrants who are in this country to help them along, and all they needed was a little hand. So now I'm going to just end with a couple of themes. When I think about my childhood and growing up in Somerville, home was more than a house. It wasn't a street address. It was a refuge. When you walked through those gates, you knew that you were loved unconditionally by not just your parents, but your grandparents, your uncles, your aunts, your cousins, and that you were accepted completely by them. And that helped you as you went out into the world. We grew up American, Mike, but our parents and grandparents still thought of themselves as Italian. And that world was an outside world still, even though we were navigating it very much as Americans. I think the second theme is that family was so important. Family was paramount. You would do anything for family in an Italian home. And the definition of family was broad. Everyone seemed to be a cousin. You had lots of aunts and uncles. Everyone seemed to be a cousin. But if it was called family, then you would do everything. And then finally, and the third thing is community was important. The Italian community in Somerville was very tight. And it wasn't just those Italians who came from Gaeta, they were tight in terms of who they were, but all of the Italians. Everyone seemed to know what every other Italian in the city was doing. Mike, I knew what your family was doing. Peter, I knew what your family was doing. Bob, we didn't know your family as well, but I knew the Galenos and the Capuanos because my grandparents would talk about them all the time. And so the community was very tight and it was very supportive of each other. And St. Anthony's Church, as we talked about before, was kind of the focal point of where this community came together. Father Perpezzi, who was a Scalabrini brother, helped build that church with the labor of the Italian immigrants. And again, it was because they said the Mass in Italian, and that was so important. And it's actually wonderful to know that the Brazilians have adopted that church, and it's their home now too. The final theme is that education was really important. And so, like Mike, my father, who spoke to me mostly in Italian or largely in Italian, expected me to respond in English because he wanted me to understand English and he wanted me to have a really good education. For him, he came to this country to, he was going to find the American dream. And he felt that the way to do that was through education. And so everything he did was to promote my education. I went from Somerville High School to Harvard to getting a graduate degree at Oxford to Georgetown Law School. And that's all because of this amazing community that put such a high priority in education. And I got scholarships all through my career. And I'm so grateful to all of the places that gave me scholarships. But again, it goes back to, if there's an embodiment of the American dream, my father was going to realize it through his children. My dad got dealt a hand in life, which was that, notwithstanding the fact that he was very much a man's man, he had one child and that was a daughter. And so he became a feminist overnight and pushed me as hard and as fast as he could push me to get through all of these hurdles I got through in my life. But anyway, I'll stop there. But thank you all for indulging us your time.
Regina, thank you so much for those wonderful memories. So we can take questions for a few minutes. If anybody has a question or maybe a very short memory they would like to share, you can either put it in the chat or you can raise your hand, and maybe Allison, you could call on people who have
Jean Shapiro, if you'd like to say something.
Yes, that's so very beautiful and very moving. I grew up in Somerville. I like to say I never grew up. I know many people of Italian and Irish descent, and I know Michael Capuano. He's a great person. Professor Green, I have a question. I didn't know till recently when I was watching something on Channel 2 that people who came here from Italy often went back. I know it was really tough there. I'm aware of that. Did other, my recent ancestors came from Russia and Poland. Was this true of other immigrant groups? Did they go back like to Ireland, Russia, Poland? I know life was hard for everybody. So I'm just curious to know.
It was more true of the Italians than any other group. It was also to some extent true about the Greeks, and much less true about anybody else. Well, hardly any Russian Jews ever went back, quite understandably. And
right.
A big difference between, for example, the Italians who often went back and the Irish who didn't go back was extreme political oppression for all the bad things the Italian government was guilty of. At least it was their government. It wasn't a foreign oppressor. In a way it was. It was the House of Piedmont. It was Northern Italians,
Right.
But not like the British as they related to the Irish.
Okay, one more thing. My mother on Curtis Avenue said, don't say someone's Irish or Italian, say they're Irish descent or Italian descent. We're all Americans. It's true.
Does anyone else have a question or a short memory?
I see Mayor Brune out there, and I wanted to give him a shout out for the arts that he and both Mike and he made possible for the city to enjoy outdoor performances and different cultural events. And I think that Somerville was always great about that. And Jean, we're just talking about the Jesus Christ Superstar event that we had the month of August back in the 90s. So I want to acknowledge both of these gentlemen because, we just can't live on bread alone.
Thank you so much, Bob. Does anyone else have a final word? Okay, well, we're
Could
going
I
to
say something?
Oh, go ahead.
Okay.
Yes.
I was trying to get unmuted and I had a tough time. Thank you, Bob. Yeah, Jesus Christ Superstar is still talked about today. That went on for at least, I don't know how many, several weeks. And we had crowds of at least 200 people there every night. And you were a great part of it with the music that you played. So I want to thank you. So I don't have a question, but I just have a statement. I love this show. I mean, I sat here and I just wish that we had 2 hours rather than 1 hour so that we could talk to each other afterwards. Because I just, between Dan Green and Mike Capuano and who else? It was Peter and Regina, who I know very well, and Bob. I've known way back with Bob. There's so much we could talk about. I could tell you stories about my father that you would like also. Played in the silent movies with Dolores Del Rio when he was just a kid growing up in the Army. But in any case, I just want to thank you all for giving us an hour and a half of good entertainment. And I just wish that we would do it again sometime. And you can, and in this city, you can do it not only with the Italians, but you could do it with the Greeks, you could do it with the Portuguese, you can go on and on and on and have the same thing. So I think it's something that the Somerville Museum should keep going and doing it every so often, every year. So I thank you all.
Thank you so much, Mayor Brune. Wait, we have one more question from Peter.
Thank you so much for this presentation. It was wonderful. I loved all the stories, and they're wonderful because in my existence as a New York Italian, I didn't get many of those stories from the old country. And I'm curious if anyone's grandparents had anything to say about the political situation in Italy when the mass immigrations occurred. Can anyone speak to that, please?
Hello. Hello. I have a quick story. My name is Ursula Susan Fontano. I'm named after my grandmother, and I go by Susan because it was the American way to do when I went to school. And my grandfather on my mother's side, Vincent Campagna, my great-grandfather was a maestro of the Naples Symphony Orchestra, but this was pre-World War II, and the fascist government over there, and my grandfather didn't like it. And when they came to America, he was a teenager. They came to New York and did a tour, and he loved America. He loved the democracy. He didn't like what Mussolini was doing, and Mussolini was friends with Hitler. And he said to my great-grandfather, I want to stay in this country. I love this America, and I want to stay here. And my great-grandfather said, well, we have to go home if that's what you want to do. They were very, very wealthy. They had their own villa. There was only he and his sister. They had private, he spoke English fluently. And sure enough, he fulfilled his dream. My great-grandfather made him come here, and he landed in Boston, and he stayed there for a while. And then in 1927, he bought the house in Somerville on Lincoln Street. And the house stayed in the family from 27 to like 2001. And when my mother got married and she was pregnant to me, she bought the house on Mount Vernon Street. That all came from that political oppression of the country, that even though he didn't really experience it, he knew better. And to follow up with Mike and a couple of the others said, when you went in the house, he wouldn't allow any of his friends to speak Italian. He wanted them all to speak, as you said, American. And that's part of our great story. We have 100 of them, but that was in my grandmother, grandfather, my father's side came from Sicily through Ellis Island. I don't know when they came in, but when they did Ellis Island all over, we bought those little bricks with their names on it. And it was Joseph and Josephine Fontano. So we're all glad they came here.
Thank you so much for that story. So what we're going to do is I'm going to ask one story from the chat, or one question from the chat, and then we'll have Andrea DiMichele be the last comment. And then we're going to go out on another recorded piece of music from Bob DeGuardia. I will mention that when we did Voices from Somerville's Greek Community, we had many people stay on after the formal event ended and share some memories. So we're going to keep the Zoom open. So after, Bob's music, if people want to stay on and share more memories, you're more than questions, you're more than free to do so. So Barbara asked on the chat, she said, I would love to hear more about how Gaeta became the town or city that so many Italian Americans came from. So Dan, I don't know if you have, or someone else has the answer to that question.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure there was much different about Gaeta than was also true about the rest of southern Italy, which was relatively ignored by the Italian government compared to the north through most of the 19th century into the early 20th century. But those of you in the audience and among the panel whose relatives did come from Gaeta, you could probably talk more specifically about that.
I can maybe say a little bit about that. The economy in Gaeta did pretty well up until about the 1900s. And then in the 1900s, I can't remember, there was some industry that was undercut, probably because of imports from the States, undercut in Gaeta, and there was a dramatic increase in poverty. So there was pressure in Gaeta for people to emigrate and find a better living. And I think that was part of the motivation for coming. Incidentally, at that time, there were two Gaetas. There was the old Gaeta and another town, which was actually called Helena or Elena, named after the Queen of Italy. And that name was changed to Gaeta. So now there's Gaeta, and then there is another part of Gaeta called Gaeta Antiqua, the antique Gaeta. But I think, like anything else, it was economic pressure. And the economic pressure lasted in Gaeta until about the 1930s, with Mussolini, of course. And there was a glass factory, a really big glass factory that was built in Gaeta. So there was a lot of work, labor building the factory and then operating the factory. Mm-hmm. And then after the war, of course, everything was a disaster.
Oh yeah, Gaeta suffered terribly in World War II. In fact, the Germans moved everybody out.
Right, that's right.
Moved everybody out during the war.
Yeah.
So Andrea, do you want to have the final question?
Oh, sorry. Oh. Hi, I just wanted to thank for organizing this. I am born, my family lives in Gaeta. I grew up mostly there and now I live in Boston. My mom's grandfather moved to Somerville around, it's unclear, 1913, 1914. And he then worked for a few, I don't know, years, months, it's not clear. And then he moved back to Gaeta and sort of like bought a house. So it's fascinating to hear your stories, and I just wanted to thank for organizing. Yeah, I don't think I have a specific question, but obviously if there is a series of how Somerville became a hub for immigrants from Gaeta, I mean, I think I would be interested in knowing more. I've studied a bit migration to the States because my background is in economics, and so I'm interested, and I know a bit about the Southern Italians patterns of migration. I have relatives in Brazil too, but if there is something, I would be glad to hear more or participate in more events. Thank you again for organizing this.
Thank you so much. And you can definitely reach out to the Somerville Museum because I think there's staff members who can share information with you.
I will.
So everybody, thank you so much. Allison, if you could play Bob DeGuardia's music to close us out. And if anyone wants to stay on to chat a little more afterwards.
Sharon, before you go, I'd like to say one quick thing, if it's okay.
Of course.
I just want to take a second to thank Gina Pisa and Evelyn Battinelli. I will tell you that, for as long as I can remember, if it wasn't for them, the Somerville Museum would have closed decades ago. And look, I've known their family. Well, my grandfather and father knew their grandparents and parents way before I was even born. And I just want to, I know this is Somerville Museum sponsored event, but I just want to be very, very clear, very, very thankful for all they have done for the museum and to keep some of these things alive. I know there are a lot of people doing it now, but for a long time, it was really just Evelyn and Regina, and I just want to take this opportunity to say thank you.
Thanks, Mike.
Hear, hear. Thank you so much. Yes, we can't ever thank Evelyn and Regina enough. Thank you so much. All right, let's hear the music.
Sharon,
Yes.
I'm sorry, I did something to my iPad, so you're not seeing me, you're seeing my chair, or Tom's chair. Sharon, thank you. Thank you so much for this. Harry, the fellow down in New Orleans, Harry Connick Jr., he is doing a program in New Orleans to celebrate the diversity of New Orleans. And I thank you for doing this for the city of Somerville.
Well, thank you, Evelyn. You know, we couldn't do any of this without you.
Okay.
A beautiful evening, everyone. And if you'd like to stay on to talk a little more, please do. Okay, so
I apologize, but I have to run.
of course, yes.
A lot of people here that I know very well, and I want to thank them all for coming, and wish I could stay a little longer, but to grab me another time.
Thank you again so much for participating. We're so grateful for your time.
It was fun.
Brandon, are you trying to say something? I think you might be muted. I still can't hear you.
So while Brandon's trying to get her mute off, I wanted to, so Dan isn't on the call anymore, but something that he said triggered something. When he said that Gaeta was evacuated basically when Mussolini came to power. My dad used to tell this story. He had been in the Italian Navy for the better part of 17 years. And when Mussolini came to power and he did this, scourge of, Jewish Italians who were Jewish, my dad's last name was Pisa, and because his father was an orphan. And in orphans, they gave the children names of either cities or colors. So you were Marone, or you were Pisa, or you were whatever the name was, the city was, it was the name you were given. And during World War II, as the occupation started, a lot of Italian Jews changed their name to cities and colors so as not to be identified as Jewish so easily by Mussolini. And when my dad was taken, here he was, he had just served through umpteen wars, was the better part of 17 years in the Italian Navy, was sent to a concentration camp because his last name was Pisa and he was suspected of being Jewish. And he had to prove that, in fact, he was Roman Catholic. And his mother had to send papers to this concentration camp to establish that he was Roman Catholic so that he would be released by Mussolini, which I always thought was an amazing story. After 17 years of service to be, Italian, whether you're Jewish or whatever you are. Anyway, so.
Oh, what a story.
Brandon, did you figure it out? You
Sorry,
actually
Brandon.
are on mute now.
Yeah, I can see you're muted, Brandon. Free to write it in the chat, Brandon.
Was this recorded? May I see this later or share it with people? It was so interesting.
Thank you so much. Yes, it is going to
Thank
be
you.
up on the Somerville Museum's website
Thank
if you
you.
look under Voices from Somerville.
Thank you.
Hello. I'd like to add something. This was such a great feel-good program tonight. And it's nice to see the different faces that come forward that are of Italian heritage and they don't have Italian last names, be it for marriage or whatever. But my grandmother, who was second generation American, my great grandmother was born in New York. My grandmother was born in Boston. She married my grandfather, who was an immigrant. When World War II broke out, and maybe Regina knows more about this, she lost her citizenship. She was a natural citizen, but she lost it. And it was Judge Foti, and I think they were from the Winchester area, that fought and fought and fought to let them get them back. And I was just going through some papers the other day, and I found we got the papers when my grandmother was reinstated. She got her citizenship back. But that's what they were doing. And they were ready to start the internment camps and stuff like that for folks that were either not American citizens from another country. But that was something that we've always appreciated, that she got that back, and the Judge Foti was instrumental with that. And I guess part of it was with the something to do with the waterfront and the different ships and stuff. They were going to close off some channels. So did you know about that, Regina, by any chance?
I didn't, Susan. I didn't know about that.
Yeah, very
I
interesting.
I'm gonna look it up though.
Susan, I know the story. Judge Foti was
Yes.
married to one of the great developers of the movie theaters in Somerville.
Okay.
And she lived until her death.
Yes.
Judge Foti died, and she remarried to another judge I think she was in her 80s. And
Wow.
then she lived in the penthouse at the Locatelli Apartments on Summer Street until almost until her death.
Yeah.
And there are
Imagine
the two buildings, the Locatelli buildings on Summer Street.
All right. Interesting. Interesting.
Her son became a judge too. And
Really?
he's living in Concord, yes.
Wow.
He donated, I can't tell you, tons. He came in with all these newspapers, Somerville Press, the Somerville Journal.
Right.
When I was mayor, she called me and she asked me if I would have dinner with her at her home on Summer Street. And I did, and she was delightful. First time I ever met her, and we became friends, only because of the fact that I happened to be mayor. And for some reason, she liked me, she called me, and we had dinner. And it was very nice, a good experience. I can tell you a little bit about my father if we have time. My father was in Abruzzo, and when he was 14, his father died, and he was very close to his father. His mother, a while later, started going out with a man that wasn't much older than my father. My father was probably 14, and he was like 19 or 20. And he was a neighborhood guy, and my father didn't like him. So, and he started going with his mother, they got married. And my father was just uncontrollable because he just did not like him. So they packed him up, and the stepfather took him to Malden and dropped him off at a cousin's house, and he never saw his mother again. And he didn't want to see his mother again. And he had no place to go. So eventually, when World War I came, he joined the army, and he was in the army. And after the war, he had no place to go again, so he joined the Navy. And that's how he met my mother. But when he was in the army, he was in Texas, waiting to be discharged. And they were shooting some movies there. And they were silent movies in those days. And they asked him if he wanted to play a part, and he did. And he said, I can remember this beautiful girl that it was a picture on the Philippine American War. And he said, I had this girl that she was working with me in the movie, kind of close together, and she was beautiful. And he told us some of the parts. So we said, Pop, he said, you might know her. We said, what's her name? He said, Dolores Del Rio. And we said, oh my God, Dolores Del Rio is famous today. So he says, I didn't know that. He said, but she was 19 and she was beautiful. When he was in the Navy, he was friendly with this man by the name of Frank Christopher, who lived at 50 Boston Avenue in Somerville. So he said to my father, I want to take you home for the weekend, and you're going to have dinner, and I want to introduce you to a couple of my cousins. So he wanted to hook my father up with my aunt named Manna. And when he saw my mother, he says, no, I want her, my mother. So they got married, and they had 6 children. And my father my father was an ornamental plasterer. The ornamental plasterer made good money in those days before the Depression. And if you know some of the churches in California and Texas, with all the angels coming down from the ceiling, that's all plaster. And that's expensive to do. And my father made good money working for it. And he worked for DePrado in Charlestown. And so then when the Depression came, he lost all his money, and he had nothing. And he has, at that time, 4 kids, and ended up with 6. And he eventually ended up working for the city of Somerville as the chief plasterer for the city. And that's what his job was until he retired. But my father was just a great guy. Didn't have one bad bone in his body as far as he didn't care whether you were black, white, yellow or blue. As long as you were a good person, that's all my father cared about. And nationality didn't mean anything. Religion didn't mean anything, even though he was religious. He just didn't have one bad bone in his body. That's the way he tried to bring us up. We could never say anything about anybody without getting, without him pointing to the whip, the razor strap, which he never used. but they was always there. We knew it was there. So he brought up 6 children, and we all ended up being pretty good people. Brandon, can you talk?
So there's a question that there used to be a statue dedicated to the veterans of the Spanish-American War in front of the library. Is it still there?
I think it still is.
Barbara, can you
Yeah,
speak
I
to
think
that?
it still is. Yeah. So my
Yeah,
father was a
yeah.
veteran of World War One. My brother was a veteran of World War II. I'm a veteran of World War II. I have another brother that was a veteran of the Korean War. 2 brother-in-laws that served in World War II. So we're a veteran family.
And I see a question from Brandon in the chat, and I'm wondering if this is her question. She said she was wondering why there was not one section of Somerville where so many Italians lived, as in many cities where there is a little Italy.
Sharon, I would like to take that question.
Great.
There's a book that I donated to the Somerville Public Library. It's called Teacher from Little Italy, and it was written by a professor, Angelo Bertocci, who came to live on Medford Street in Somerville when he was 3 years old from Gaeta. His brother was 7 months old when they came, and they all, most of the Gaetans settled in the Brick Bottom, Linwood Street. In fact, my husband came when he was 5, and he lived on Linwood Street. But that whole group down there was mostly from Gaeta. And this professor grew up, and he was helped by many mentors along his way to be, to achieve the American dream. And in this book, one of the quotes that he makes is that these people that mentored him, he said, the patriotic occasions, they crowned America's good with brotherhood, because so many of them helped you along the way. And his brother Peter taught at Boston University for 45 years, I believe, and has an endowed chair at BU. 2 little kids that came from Gaeta, Italy in 1912.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Evelyn. And just to answer the question about the statue dedicated to the veterans of the Spanish-American War, Barbara knows that it's not there right now. It's going to return when the Central Hill landscaping is complete. Yes, and we just hear Melissa. I see you had the same comment. Yep. Well.
Thanks, everyone. This was terrific. Thank you, Sharon, for all your good work.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Good work, Evelyn. Thanks again. This was a lot of fun.
Have a great evening, everybody.
Good night, everybody.